I've always had trouble starting these videos, and the biggest reason is that talking about builds kind of sucks, at least for now, which is basically why I'm talking about them. There isn't nearly as much structure as there could be to discussions of builds and their accompanying game design, and we would have more fun if that was different. But I'm not making this video to complain. Well, not anymore, that's what this intro was for. I would just like you to understand where I'm coming from. I'm here to do something about it. That's this channel's goal. And so this time we're doing a video about some problems with discussing what I call build systems and the builds within them, and then I'll suggest some things we can do about those problems. Welcome aboard, and welcome to section 1, expectations. There are a lot of things you could enjoy about making builds, whatever you feel that is. 3 example things that lots of people enjoy to various degrees about making builds are making or seeing something unusually powerful, setting things to taste in a way you specifically find very fun, and manipulating the mechanics available to generate highly optimized devices with which to deal with the game's challenges. And what I meant at the start of this video by saying that there isn't a lot of structure to how we discuss builds is that as far as I can see, we don't have a useful way to limit the scope of what we're talking about when builds come up. And the subject is broad enough for that to be a problem. If you want to talk about borderline exploits that are super overpowered, and I want to talk about my preferences to make gameplay feel comfortable, we can both use the term build, and neither of us are appreciably wrong, or it's reasonably useful to refer to both of those things as topics related to making builds in isolation, but we may or may not be completely misunderstanding each other. Those things could be surprisingly similar or very different. It depends what we mean specifically, and it depends on the game in question. So the term build is unhelpfully open-ended. I suppose having more terms for each of those 3 appeals would be a decent start. You could specify a bit more, but I'm not going to get into that yet, and you'll get why in section 2. Because obviously to some extent, it's not that confusing. I would of course know what you meant if you asked me what my build was right now in Risk of Rain 2. You're probably asking for an idea of the items I have, or the items I'm hoping for or trying to get, and maybe the abilities I chose at character selection. Or if my run was heating up, you would then more likely be asking what combination of items or effects creates the powerful combo you may think you're seeing. In one context, you were more likely asking about certain meanings of build, and in another context, it seemed more like you meant certain other things by build. Seems like no problem. Now, in this example, talking about builds isn't very meaningful in Risk of Rain 2, in my opinion, for a bunch of reasons. One of them is that a lot of the items in the game are dispensed randomly. You usually get items at random. You open a chest and you get an item of that rarity, but you can't pick which item it is. You can pick which chests to open, you know, which rarities of item to get sometimes. And there are occasionally shops where you can pick between 3 items, but most of the time you get items randomly. A lot of items, totally randomly. So not only do you not choose the items, you also get a lot of items, meaning that you get the average items a good amount of the time. Which that's intended because a lot of the items in the game are also designed to kind of combo into most of the other items in the game. You can see that when I kill one enemy in a lot of these example pieces of footage, there's a kind of chain reaction where a lot of other effects go off and nearby enemies die or take significant damage as well, because a lot of the items in the game will trigger each other. I'll kill an enemy and this will trigger some damage that kills other enemies, which might trigger damage that kills other enemies. It might trigger chain lightning, which will kill another enemy and trigger another explosion. You get it. You can see it. And so because of that, I don't really consider Risk of Rain 2 to be a game about making different builds. There arguably kind of aren't different builds. For the most part, the items are designed so that they will form a single, you might say, cohesive build, regardless of what exact mix of them you get. But you see how relatively long it took to explain why builds may or may not be that meaningful here? It's rather subtle, I hope you'll agree. I chose Risk of Rain 2 specifically for the first part of this video because I think it's kind of near the boundary of what most people would consider a build system. I think various elements of its design place it clearly outside of those bounds for me, but my hope was that using this game as an example would get some questions or objections floating around from you folks. Another feature I'll mention is the Artifact of Command. This is a setting you can unlock that changes the item drops into a selector thing. And the selector lets you pick any item of that rarity. So this is a common chest. Normally I'd get a random item, but when I open it with Artifact of Command on, I get a little selector thing that lets me pick any common item. Even if you haven't played this game, that setting feels like a little step in the direction of making builds, don't you think? Because of what I mentioned before about how items are designed to combo together, I think it largely doesn't change things. It may just reveal that all-encompassing synergy the game is built around, where it might have been unclear before. But I'm sure to some people, it will feel like there are now distinct and achievable builds with the Artifact of Command. It's not like there are literally no arguable and meaningful choices here. I don't think picking items in an exact order is demonstrably much better than various other orders you could pick items in. It's not like no items synergize with different items. It's not like every item synergizes together with every other item. Anyway, I think it's a good gray area example. I hope that makes sense. I also want to point out to you that if you're interested in unusually powerful combinations, that one appeal of making builds out of many, maybe Risk of Rain 2 actually is a pretty interesting build-making game where your choices are about hitting a critical mass of interconnected effects as fast as possible or in unexpected ways. I don't know, I don't have every perspective, but I can imagine some people enjoying that, and thinking of it as making builds makes some sense to me, even if it's not what I think I like. Certainly in terms of content, Risk of Rain 2 has most of the components of a build, the screens you'd expect to see, the basic elements of design that could lead to builds. It's only arguably not build-crafty in important but subtle ways that you would experience in-game, but can't necessarily see going in. For example, the exact degree of the randomness. Exactly how the items work. Do they combine together like I was describing in Risk of Rain 2? These are the subtle things that set the system apart, but they are just hard to see from far away. The key elements are subtle. Hopefully this is a more complete picture of the issue. When talking about games, it's very difficult to describe specifically what type of fulfillment they'll give you if you're generally interested in builds. It's easy for a game to fulfill one appeal, completely neglect others, but then appear no different from a game that would appeal to various other build-making tastes, and it takes an impractical amount of time to find that out for a given game. But I was trying to transition to another point already, so that'll be section 3. For now, expectations. Other people have different ones. For developers, consider that a build system is not one thing. What sorts of things is your system trying to emphasize? How are you telegraphing that to your players? And players, let's say there's this game with a build system that looks pretty interesting. What exactly is that build system trying to let you do? Does it actually serve your specific interests, or merely look broadly build-crafty? Or perhaps that's what you want. What specifically do you want? Usually the things that will define the build-making appeals that a system fulfills will be small details you wouldn't be able to find at a glance. So don't get distracted by a game that, for example, seems to give out random upgrades. That's not enough information to be useful yet. How random are they? Random in what way? Developers consider making these things as clear as possible, and players seek out those specific details. We'll all play games we like more that way. Alright, you'll recall a bit earlier, I suggested that it seems like some specific terms would help, but my concern is that there's already a sort of default good. I argued that there already is a sort of default assumption about what a build is, or what discussing a build entails. Even though most people wouldn't be confused if you said you actually cared about a few other things more, there is still a sort of default good or standard that people assign to almost all discussions about builds, at least that I've seen. And so that complicates things if we're going to try to be more specific about what we're discussing. First of all, what is this default I'm referring to? You might have experienced it differently. I'll tell you my experience, so here it is. Regardless of what a game emphasizes, most people, in my experience, give priority to things you can demonstrate or sort of prove are good, in this case meaning numerically effective. The consequence is that sharing a build with no context almost always results in people interpreting it as a build that is trying to be coldly, calculatingly effective, even though a significant number of games don't much reward making builds like that, and a significant number of players don't intend that for their builds. So it's as if to say that the default or pre-assumed goal for any given build is that it will be technical or powerful or something else perhaps. You might have experienced a different default in a different community. It doesn't matter exactly what it is, I argue that there is a default assumption. To be clear, literally the entire point of this chonky video, and my channel as a whole, is to go beyond that. I think raw numerical effectiveness is a rather small part of what can be interesting about build systems. I'm just saying that I perceive a much narrower take from many other people. And of course, it's easy to see why that might be. After all, how exactly can we discuss the merits of a build idea if it's just you arbitrarily like this? We can say, yeah, that's valid, cool, but is there much to discuss? In my experience, yes, there is, but it takes more effort, and you get my point. It doesn't seem like you can quantify other things as easily as this default value people tend to think of. Let's try though. I will now make some simple terms for those 3 potential appeals in making builds from section 1. I'm going to give them basic names that are things I've heard other people call these concepts. I don't necessarily think these are good names, but here we go. So we've got 3, and I've heard them referred to as comfort, flashiness, and potency. But the entire problem, remember, is that people assume they have the single correct definition when correctness isn't useful. It comes at the expense of communication. So I will now talk about each one, as I understand it, at some length. Comfort. Maybe you want your builds to make the act of playing the game as cozy or effortless as possible, or you want to redistribute the effort and put a lot of effort into your build, thereby less effort into operating or piloting that build. You might fatigue your hands less, or press less buttons, or this build requires no careful timing, and thus reduces stress. I would imagine the feeling of dominating the game is in here too. You may feel very powerful with a build that makes something potentially difficult go very smoothly. These sorts of builds get the job done in a way you find useful, often also because there may not always be much to gain by making something stronger, so you invested in quality of life in its many forms instead. Flashiness. This is a little bit more my name based on how people's comments read to me. I'm trying to broaden this category a bit. I had trouble finding things that people were calling this one. Overpoweredness, sure. For now, this could be your do all the things, press all the buttons, use a very weird interaction to create a very big explosion, or leverage an exception to a rule to create a combo. They're exciting to some people, and it's not just exploits. There's a sense of discovery in build systems that I think is the root of what many people really enjoy. Oh, there we go. How about referring to this as a sense of discovery? Or the good thing about this may simply be that you discovered it. Isn't this neat? Often it is. You can see that part of the practical advice from this little exercise is that you can have better discussions about this stuff simply by thinking about what you like more. You will naturally have more to say about it and more language for that. That worked for me very well just then. Potency. You know, it's often numerically powerful. It does a lot of damage, it's fast or efficient, a well-tuned machine. This is the one that I've experienced as the default thing assumed to be good, and it's hard to argue that it's irrelevant. It's part of the flavor of many exciting build discoveries and comfortable luxury builds of all sorts. I think a sense of mastery is in here too. You have the game's various options at your command, and you assemble them to make something powerful. As someone who isn't as interested in this one, I do want to say there's a really common way I care about making my builds potent, and it's as a way to enable something else I care about. I'll try to very efficiently make my build strong enough to deal with the challenges the game presents, so that I have room to also bring along something that's not usually or conventionally powerful, but which I enjoy for some other reason. That process also kind of sounds like what I described for comfort. Anyway, the whole point is that they overlap. It's not like people care exclusively about just one. Okay, listen up. Those were just words that seemed to relatively generally refer to these general appeals. They are not official terms, nor would official terms be useful because most people wouldn't know them. Do not say, your build is potent, and then if someone misunderstands that, say, Zandy told you that is what that means, so that person is an idiot. No, if you do that, you are an idiot. The purpose of this exercise was to demonstrate that saying more directly what you value in a build can be helpful, and also to show you how varied even those more specific appeals are. Not everyone making what they might call potent builds cares about the same things, and people generally don't only care about just one appeal at a time. So, countering the default good. Since we do have to pick some words to use for such things, it's not evil to sometimes use technical terms when they seem useful to you. I just think it's good to be critical and use them carefully. You can have a better conversation if you push yourself to be more specific about what you're saying you like. Ideally, folks would just take the time to explain what they mean in detail, but lacking that, Rather than saying that something in a build is just good, saying it's potent, or at least something else, is an attempt to clarify what you think is good. If someone else looks at your build and thinks, wow, that doesn't look very fun to play, that doesn't seem good to me, well, you did say a thing that you valued about it specifically. No matter what you say, that at least acknowledges that you specifically value a thing about the build, and hopefully people try to understand that a little bit more. And you said it was potent. That's at least an attempt to clarify things. Even better if you explain briefly what that means to you or how you use the build. And perhaps doing that, you can skip a tedious initial stage of discussion and get some interesting thoughts from people. I know from experience that it may be frustrating to not say if you're aware there is a term that's associated with a thing you're explaining. For YouTube stuff, for example, I often end up putting my term before my explanation, even though I don't want to, because I just have no choice. My explanation won't fit in the title, but the term will. That happens a lot in this video, actually. And it can be a little frustrating to go into the trouble of explaining and then someone comments, oh, this is just called that. Yes, we know, commenter, but explaining it is better, and this video is over 20 minutes long. I made time to explain. But in any case, I say, go ahead and use the term too. What I often do is I'll fully explain and then include any terms at the end, which may help with further reading or context. Maybe I'd say, in Warframe, the reason this fun and powerful effect isn't as exciting to me is because I have to equip it instead of lots of other fun and powerful effects, or it has a high opportunity cost, and other things are good at different things. There. I said what I specifically meant instead of assuming we all shared a single, rigid definition of, in this case, opportunity cost, and I still mentioned that afterward, so perhaps people can find more discussion about that easier, or they might understand better when others are talking about such things going forward. We often do share reasonably close definitions for such things, but I didn't rely on the terms and assume anyone knew what I meant by them. Yeah, in my experience, this helps a lot, and I've seen others follow along if I start things off by explaining this way. By setting a tone for discussion that revolves around explaining your reasoning and trying to understand others, I've had some of the most fruitful conversations of my career while live streaming on Twitch, if you can believe that. That's been with some of you who've already made your way over there. Those of you folks have probably been patiently waiting for this section to end now, but I thank you for humoring me. I just want more juicy discussions that actually go somewhere and less people talking past each other. And speaking of talking past things, there's now a third problem before us. Well, actually, there was a third problem before us in section 1, but it's that the existing build systems we have, that you could be discussing, are often not that focused on builds themselves. You aren't going to find a very focused community when you discuss most games that might have a build system in them because the game is arguably not very focused on making builds. Usually, you find build systems wrapped up in grinding and gambling. Spending your playtime unlocking choices for your build doesn't always make for a game that's fun if you want to be making builds or trying a lot of new builds. I mentioned the term grinding here in a very general sense, just that you have to unlock stuff by doing somewhat repetitive tasks. A lot of games have some grinding, and it is a matter of degree here. Randomness can slow things down a lot too, whether that's randomly acquiring game pieces altogether, or something like randomized stats. Again, I'm using gambling in a very general way here. It's not as if these things prevent you from making builds, but they do create a situation where you probably have to spend quite a bit of time playing the game, but not doing anything related to making builds. They don't always make for games focused on builds. And you might be thinking that's kind of a given. What do you mean a game more focused on making builds? You've got to earn the pieces for the build. And that is how it feels right now. I mean, that's most of the games we have right now. But to put it another way, you can certainly imagine a game where you don't need to unlock a lot of options before you grind a lot or whatever. That's obviously possible to make, it would just have consequences. Sometimes that's possible within these existing games. For example, in Genshin Impact, it does hold your options back if you don't get new characters from the game's character rolling gachapon gambling system, but if you just do get a new character right away, you save up what little currency the game gives you, or you get lucky. The very fact that you acquire characters this way has in that case enabled you to have a much more build-focused experience, where playing the game, playing the update, is a chance to play with your new game piece, rather than for your new game piece. Rather than playing to earn options, you have options and then play with them. But of course, Genshin Impact isn't really structured to reliably offer that experience, it's just possible sometimes, and so a useful example. And another example would be games where you can directly buy a new build option in a cash shop. Do I like that? Usually no. Would it significantly change the game's appeal if you did get your new build options right away? Clearly yes. And there's all sorts of things to learn from this situation. Lots of games use build pieces like gear or new abilities and such as rewards, and so you can't easily just give the player all of that stuff and manifest new rewards. But in our example here, well, Genshin Impact did just give me this new character at the very start of the update. What does this game do to compensate for that and present me with something to earn, since that's how this game's gameplay loop is designed? And in this case, well, it's materials to level up the character, so grinding. But you can imagine something like story progress, or playtime, or a unique character quest replacing these material grinds, a non-repetitive and non-random way to progress. Why isn't there more of that? I think it all comes back to content. Offering material grinding like this is a cheap way to add playtime to a game, and there are lots of other things you could do instead. They just mostly require a lot more work, often an unrealistic amount of work. Imagine a dungeon for each character, specifically designed for you to go nuts making and playing with builds for each individual character in this game, and that's how you level them up. That would be a way more build-focused experience, and I think way more fun for some players. But in a game not completely focused on that, you can see how that would be a ridiculous amount of work for something many players would consider a hassle compared to just grinding for materials. I mean, I like having some normal difficulty fights just to enjoy the teams I've built for myself. Having some grinding is not necessarily bad. And randomly acquiring build options can lead to lots of interesting stuff. That's a fun way to get creative and make new builds. Again, potentially not a bad thing, just that in many games it goes well beyond that. On the other hand, you could have basically nothing in place of the grinding and gambling. For some people, it might feel like if you remove the material grind or whatever, there would be no purpose to playing the game. And that's the trouble with the state of build systems at the time of this recording. The build options are often used as a reward for the grinding, so the game feels subtly like it's about grinding and not so much about the options. And it goes further. If these games are built around grinding, well, there's an expectation that new options will be better, not merely different. And having options that are designed to be directly better than other options gets the player in the mindset that a new thing is supposed to be better, rather than the point being that they're different things to try. But I, for one, am a player who often drops games because I would have to grind for the build options, and in many cases, if that's alleviated somehow, I jump right back in and have a great time. One memorable example for me was Deep Rock Galactic, where I learned how you randomly earned these endgame overclocks, dropped the game, eventually got around to modding it to just unlock them all, and then went right back to having a great time for many dozens of hours. For me, the endgame was trying different combinations of mods and perks, so to play so much just to earn those options felt empty to me. I wanted to play with those options, not for them. But it's the opposite way for plenty of folks I've encountered since. And naturally, because we have so few cases that don't involve gambling and grinding, I too can't really know how much I like builds alone. I may value grinding more than I think I do, or even less than I think I do. And gambling, I'm still kind of haunted by the fact that many of my favorite build systems over the last few years have come in the form of these character gambling gacha systems. Likely because making money by selling characters this way incentivizes the developer and publisher to make a variety of characters interesting, and in the best cases, the result is an excellent build system. Although not because that's the game's goal necessarily, I think it's more often because there simply has to be a system that rewards some variety, or you would find new characters less useful, which would meaningfully impact sales. Not everyone is rolling for gameplay, but plenty of people are, or care about that at least some amount, so these games align the thing that matters to me, interesting and meaningful choices in gameplay to make builds with. They align that with what matters to people who would otherwise get in the way of my fun, basically the people who are in it for the money. And the result is a game that can invest directly in both its earnings and my fun, kind of at the same time, rather than one or the other, like many games do. You know, the consequence is predatory gambling microtransactions, and it's so hard to figure out whether a game will offer that meaningful choice from the outside, as we talked about in previous sections, that most games with these gacha systems are soulless cash grabs, and there's really no way to tell from the outside. So few are doing interesting things with their design. I'm certainly not recommending these character rolling systems as a way to find good build systems. I hope that's clear. It's just fascinating and frustrating how much they vary in quality. And you can see how that's going to make for a complicated community, not exactly a group of people all excited to discuss making builds, or all united by basically any single part of these deeply compromised games. And I argue that most of the build systems we have are in games like this, which makes clear discussion hard. I think my actionable takeaway for you here is to think about what you like in games, or what you think is working in games, while keeping in mind that your goal, or what's good in a game, may not be the game's goal. Often you'll have a more specific purpose in mind for the game, and it can be useful to notice when a game perhaps isn't directly trying to make what you like about it, or what is good about it, the thing that is good or most emphasized about it. When you make builds in particular, I think you'll often find that games don't seem fully committed to that experience. It's much more often a relative side feature, in my opinion, something you could do, but which the game is not primarily structured around. Noticing that will hopefully help narrow down what's working well for each of us about these games and get to whatever specific stuff we each like faster. And what might discussing builds sound like if there were more games with great build systems that didn't force you to grind or gamble for them? That's the video, folks. I've been Zandy, and I have no idea what that might look like. But mark my words, we are sure going to find out.